Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Extending Care, Supporting Young People's Transition from Out-of-Home Care to Adulthood. My name's Stuart Muir, a Senior Research Fellow here at the Australian Institute of Family Studies. Before we start today, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're meeting. In Melbourne, the traditional custodians are the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to elders from other communities who may be participating today. Today's webinar will discuss recent research on the social and economic benefits of extending care to young people transitioning from out-of-home care into adulthood. And we're very privileged to have two eminent speakers to discuss this topic. We have Philip Mendez, Director of the Social Inclusion and Social Policy Research Unit in the Department of Social Work at Monash University, and Paul McDonald, CEO of Anglicare Victoria. Philip has been researching state care and transitions from care for over 20 years. He's the Australian representative on the Transitions to Adulthood for Young People Leaving Public Care International Research Group, and has undertaken research on youth justice, employment and mentoring programs, disability and Indigenous care leavers, and is also currently leading a national study of Indigenous young people leaving care, which is funded by the Sydney Myer Foundation. Please head to our website for information about the range of publications that Philip's authored on these subjects. Joining Philip is Paul McDonald. Paul will be drawing on his extensive experience leading numerous government and non-government social welfare initiatives to improve outcomes for young people. In addition to his role for Anglicare Victoria, Paul is President of the Centre for Excellence in Child and Family Welfare, was recently appointed State Chair of the Reform of the Out-of-Home Care System for the Victorian Government, and is Chair of the Home Stretch campaign. During the webinar today, we encourage you to send your questions throughout for Philip and Paul to answer during our Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Those questions we can't get to during the session will be posted and answered in the online forum following this presentation. Please let us know if you don't want your question published on the online forum. As always, our webinars are recorded. The slides are available in the handout section of the GoToWebinar, and the audio, slides, transcript and recording of the webinar will also be available on our website in the coming week. So I'd now like to hand over to Philip Mendez, and please everyone give him a warm virtual welcome.
Thank you, Stuart. So, young people transitioning from out-of-home care, often called care leavers or care experienced young people, are universally a vulnerable group who have generally not received the ongoing and holistic support that they require to transition successfully into adult life. Now, leaving care is formally defined as the end of legal responsibility by the state for young people living in out-of-home care, which generally occurs at no later than 18 years of age. And care leavers generally experience accelerated and compressed transitions to adulthood. And as a consequence, they often face significant barriers to accessing educational, employment, housing, health, and other developmental and transitional pathways and opportunities that are readily available to their non-care peers in the general community. Now, historically, most countries have provided only limited leaving care or post-care support services. But over the last two decades, there has been growing international awareness of the needs of care leavers and an expectation of ongoing care beyond 18 years of age. Consequently, most of the countries in the OECD and many other jurisdictions have introduced new legislation or expanded existing laws, policies or programs to assist this group of young people. Now, that upgraded assistance seems to reflect an increasing recognition that if the invasive state intervention into families by child protection systems is to be justified, then governments have both the moral and the legal obligation to devote sufficient resources to ensure that the outcomes for these rescued children are better than if they had remained with their family of origin. So in this webinar, we're specifically going to look at some of the extended care reforms in both England and the USA. England introduced the Children Leaving Care Act 2000 in October 2001, which was followed by similar legislation in Northern Ireland and Scotland. That act was intended, quote, to improve the life chances of young people living in and leaving care, quote unquote, and to replicate the supports that responsible parents would be expected to provide for their children. It extended the expected age of leaving care from 16 to 18 years and obliged local authorities to continue to provide advice and support for care leavers up to the age of 21 and even to 24 years for those still in education and training. In short, the intention was to delay the transition from care until young people were both prepared and ready to leave. So the Act introduced an expectation of corporate parenting responsibility to provide ongoing support to care leavers in order to promote better outcomes. So overall, the Act significantly extended the duties and powers of the earlier Children Act in England, and local authorities throughout England were then obliged to assess the needs of all young people in care and required to develop a pathway plan at the age of 16 years to meet those needs and provide a clear road to independence. Furthermore, the authorities had to arrange for care leavers to have a personal advisor until they were 21 years of age who would coordinate the services required to meet the pathway plan. Now, that new Act in England produced a mixture of positive and negative results. So, on the one hand, there appeared to be an increased number of young people in further education and a reduction in the numbers of those care leavers not in education, training or employment. In addition, there seemed to be gains in accommodation, financial support, improvements in life skills, and development of social networks and staffing for leaving care services. On the other hand, there were still problems in areas like resources, planning, availability and provision of health services. There arguably remain too many young people still not in education, employment or training, a lack of specialist supports for young people with a disability and those with mental health or emotional or behavioural difficulties, and a lack of suitable accommodation. So one key policy response to those concerns was the introduction of a form of extended care in England known as the Staying Put program, which was introduced as a pilot from 2008 to 11 in 11 local authorities and then legislated as an ongoing duty on all local authorities in England from May 2014 in the Children and Families Act 2014. So that act required local authorities in England to facilitate, monitor and support staying put arrangements for fostered young people until they reach the age of 21, where this is what they and their foster carers want, unless the local authority considers that the staying put arrangement is not consistent with the welfare of the young person. Now, Emily Munro, who is now at the University of Bedfordshire, and her colleagues completed an evaluation of the staying put trial in 2012, and they used a range of mixed methods in their evaluation. What they found were systemic benefits of the staying put extended foster care program, including the following: stable and supportive relationships providing ongoing emotional support to young people who are not developmentally ready for adulthood at 18 years, and housing and associated stability which facilitates engagement in education, employment and training, and enables young people to undertake a gradual transition that mirrors the pathways of their peers in the general population. Specific positive outcomes included greater housing stability and higher engagement in education or training and employment, including greater access to higher education, which should lead to higher future earnings and less reliance on public benefits. Now, to date, there has been no formal evaluation of the ongoing staying put program, but informal reports from researchers and policy advocates in England emphasise the importance of the duties being backed up by adequate resources to ensure sufficient information is available to young people and foster carers, plus consistency of service delivery across all regions to facilitate access to the option of staying put. And then there is the USA. So the USA introduced the Foster Care Independence Act in December 1999, which expanded room and board for young care leavers aged 18 to 20 years, expanded access to Medicaid for care leavers, provided additional funds for education and training, and increased state accountability for care leaver outcomes. The Act was a significant improvement at that time in terms of offering greater support to meet care leavers' needs around access to housing, health services, in particular mental health services, and education and training. However, research revealed that funding remained inadequate to meet the needs of most care leavers. Take up by states in regards to healthcare was discretionary, and optimal implementation of that Act depended on their willingness in states to match federal funds with required levels of individual state funding. Consequently, the USA enacted the Fostering Connections Act in 2008 as a form of extended care, which aimed to extend the Foster Care Independence Act by giving states the option of maintaining young people in foster care until 21 years of age. There is a requirement to be eligible that young people are completing secondary school or equivalent, or enrolled in post-secondary or vocational school, or participating in a program or activity that promotes or removes barriers to employment, or are employed 80 hours a month, or alternatively are incapable of school and or work requirements due to a documented medical condition or disability. By early 2017, nearly half of all American states had taken up this option of extending care till 21 with federal financial support. Now, Professor Mark Courtney, a leading researcher in America, and his colleagues in California used a number of mixed methods in their evaluation of extended care in California. And they were able to report specific benefits of extended care, such as the following: enhanced educational outcomes, improved earnings and less economic hardship, fewer earlier pregnancies, lower levels of homelessness, reduced mental health difficulties or involvement in the criminal justice system, and greater involvement of non-custodial fathers with their children. Additionally, the New Zealand-based researcher Ian Matheson completed a mapping exercise of the international evidence base for extended care last year. He used a number of methods and was able to cite evidence of consistent positive outcomes in education, reduced criminal justice involvement, housing stability, and more positive transitioning overall. However, he concluded that the results concerning earnings, delayed pregnancies, and engagement with training and employment seemed to be more varied. Now, Ian Matheson argues that extended care works for a number of clear reasons: because it offers continuity and stability to young people, a nurturing environment, it helps engagement in education, employment and training, it empowers young people, and it gives them greater choice and control over the timing and the process of their transition. He notes that outcomes can be fluid depending on a range of factors, including whether extended care is offered universally to all care leavers or not, whether it includes residential care or not, whether it allows those who left earlier than 18 years to return before they turn 21, and whether or not it includes strict conditions like full-time involvement in education, employment and training. Effectiveness may also vary across different political regimes and cultures in different countries. So he recommends a strong co-design or co-production approach and an evaluative approach for optimal outcomes. So to conclude briefly with lessons for Australia, remembering that both England and the USA have very different health and welfare systems to Australia, but nevertheless, the evidence does suggest that extended care in Australia should lead to improvements in the key areas like education and employment, housing, health, and reduced involvement in offending and criminal justice. But we need to remember that effective implementation requires 1, detailed planning, 2, sufficient funding, and 3, ongoing monitoring and evaluation.
Okay, so hello everyone, great to be with you on this AFES webinar. I'm Paul McDonald, Chair of the Homestretch movement and also CEO of Anglicare Victoria. I'm going to talk to you about the extended care reform progress and debate that's been going on in Australia and how jurisdictions are faring in each of those on their activities and consideration for implementing extended care as very much what we've seen internationally here in Australia. The way to maybe I thought I'd kick off is show you a short video just for 2 minutes, and it's just to summarise the issues around extended care, how young people suffer, I'd have to say, in such sort of direct terms when care is terminated at 18, as is evident in all jurisdictions around Australia. Now, just on the video, folks, if the video doesn't play, I request you to stay with us. It only goes for a couple of minutes, and then we'll resume the webinar. Your internet or systems may struggle, though it is, and we apologise for any inconvenience if that is the case. What AFES will also do, though, is they'll put the video up on the Child Family Community Australia website or CFCA, so you can access it there as well. So I might turn to my team of technical colleagues, and they're going to press the button, and let's see how we go. Okay, well, hopefully a number of you or many of you just got a sense of that video. If you didn't get a sense, I'm going to walk you through the case anyway, so you haven't missed anything. And you can also find that video up on YouTube. Where I thought I'd go first is what is out-of-home care. And basically, out-of-home care, it refers to statutory care of children and young people who are unable to live with their parents. So children out-of-home care, in most cases, also on a care and protection order. They may have been removed due to abuse, neglect, or relinquishment reasons. There are around 40, well, you know, depending on the latest stats, and I'm certainly here in the building of AFES, so I think there'd be upgraded stats here, but let's say there's around 50,000 young people who are in out-of-home care. Most of those are in foster care and kinship care, with around 5 to 6% who are in also residential care. And about a third of those, a bit over a third, are children of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander descent. So, in a sense, when we're thinking about this target group, and I'm talking to you about the target group between 15 and 17 years, when the state normally sets about the process of exiting or terminating care. When you look across Australia, there's around, in jurisdictional terms, nationally there's 3,000 young people who will be exiting between 15 and 17 every year from state care. And hopefully you can see the slide of the breakdown of the different states in relation to how many from each state that are exited. But every year, around 3,000 are exited. Now, if what we do know about this target group, and there's been many centimetres of research, I'd have to say, here in Australia, that talk about the outcomes for children and young people when they do leave care. What we do know, and you might have noticed Swinburne University Technology back in 2015, who did their national survey of homeless youth, found that 63% of them were actually in state care historically and were now homeless. When you have a look at some of the other outcomes, 35% had 5 or more places of stay in their first 12 months from leaving care. Just under 30% were unemployed. Many of them were new parents. And also many, particularly the young men, just around 40% had been involved in the juvenile justice system, again, within the first 12 months of the care being terminated. And what we do know, and what's great to do this webinar with you in AIFS, was yesterday the Australian Institute of Family Studies, you might have seen it, released a report about how young people are remaining in the family home for longer. Now there's some, I think it's 43%, the AIFS report announced yesterday, of 20 to 24-year-olds, up from 36%, are still in the family home. Goodness me, 17% of 25 to 29-year-olds are still in the family home. Yet, in every state in Australia, legislatively speaking, care is to be terminated, ended, without discretion, without any discussion, at 18. Now, what does this in fact mean? Well, their work is removed, all legal, physical, domestic support is then terminated, and they're required to fend for themselves. There may be, in different states, that you may be occupying some leaving care programs, but the important point here is that the care is terminated. It is not disrupted, terminated. So it finishes, has to continue in some other guise. So what we've seen is West Australia, South Australia, Tasmania, Victoria, ACT, New South Wales, Queensland and Northern Territory all universally have their legislation that care is to be finished at 18, and all universally have their care planning requirements are required to begin with a child at 15. Now, can you imagine going up to your own child at 15 and saying, oh, by the way, Johnny, we've got to get you a leaving care plan. This is what the state does to children in state care, requires them to have a care leaving plan at 15. Now, really, as we know as parents, as we know in raising children ourselves, or even corporately, what I mean by that, of raising children in the care system, we know they're not ready to go at 18. So Homestretch argues, why don't we provide the option for the care placement to continue past 18 through to 21, to guarantee that, and in fact actually build that in when they're doing their leave care planning at 15 to ensure that there's certainty and continuity. We know, and Phil's just very eloquently described the international progress where care is extended, 46 states in the United States, so it's virtually across the country there. We have England also implemented to 21 years. So it's interesting when you go to the States, folks. You go to the States and says, how's this foster care system going through to, the extended through to 21? And they say, what do you mean? Foster care is through to 21. Foster care is 21. So it's actually very much in their DNA that care does not finish up until 21. Yet we continue in Australia to have an artificial, dated, backward-thinking, non-contemporary parent way of looking at children in state care. And what we're saying is that it's time for Australia to catch up with the rest of the world. So, the next slide that I'm showing you on your screen at the moment are the evaluations that Phil mentioned and referred to, but just specifically on number terms, the reports have shown that's halved the homeless rate for this cohort, halved it by 50%, doubled the education participation rate of this cohort. 38% of reductions in youth pregnancies. Encourage you to have a look at the Cal Youth study, which is the Courtney study on extended care in California. Reduced arrests by 54%. So compelling stats. So what we went on and looking at in relation to child and family welfare reform was considered in the UK by Amanda Cumberland, who was the parliamentary advisor at the time, was the most significant child welfare reform in the United Kingdom. Well, we want to get a piece of that here in Australia, don't we, folks? So what we decided to do was that we went to Deloitte Access Economics and we asked them, could they do a similar cost-benefit study, state by state, and imagine if care was extended to 21, what would be the benefits? What would be the outcomes? What would be the costs to the state? Are there in fact actually economic as well as social outcomes that can be delivered? And what's interesting here on the next slide, which I'm talking about the current financial impact, it's not only the state and territory that have to do some fairly significant costs when we terminate care at 18, and I'll show you those in a tick. It's 600 million, but it's interestingly the Commonwealth, who does not have jurisdiction over child welfare here in this country, they're paying 1.8 billion over the next 10 years if we continue to have care terminated at 18. That being costs in Centrelink payments, costs in as due to early pregnancies, costs in hospitalisation, you name it. So Deloitte Access Economics has found that if we do not extend care through to 21, the costs to the country will be 2.4 billion. 1.8 billion the Commonwealth are picking up the cheque, and 0.6 billion or 600 million for the state and territory. So Deloitte and Access Economics said, on a cost-benefit ratio, if we did implement extended care, that is, if we allowed the placement to continue through to 21, and on current figures, and this is on current figures, if around 30% of children who were in care took up the option. Now remember, I'll just detour here a little bit, we're not arguing or suggesting that every child in state care should continue on to 21. Many will choose their own path, many will say, great, I can't wait to get out of here, and bang, off they go. But for those who aren't ready, or for those 7 months pregnant, those who got caught next week, those hopelessly unemployed, those on the spectrum order, those who are very well adjusted but aren't very independently ready, for all of those, could we allow that option for them to remain? Now, Deloitte Access Economics on the economic argument said that in fact there's a cost-benefit return. There's a return on every $1. If a government invested $1 into extending care, their return will be, well, New South Wales, $3.40, Queensland, $2.69, Tasmania, $2.69, as the list goes on. It's all there in front of you. So there's a return on investment for government. So not only is this producing good social return, but it's producing good economic return for state governments. And on the social return, Deloitte Access Economics said if we did what the States, what the UK, what New Zealand are planning to do, then measured against homelessness rates, we'll see reductions in teen pregnancy from 16% to 10.2%, homelessness reduction for this cohort from 39% to 19.5%. I mean, hospitalisation reduced from 29% to 19%, so there's about a third there. Interaction with the criminal justice reduced again by around a third. Mental illness reduced, interestingly, such a focus of this election campaign. Mental illness reduced very significantly, and so on and so forth. So it's a simple reform with social outcomes and proof and evidence of social returns that are really giants in the social policy area for outcomes. Now, how could this work? How would we do this? Well, just briefly, how we do it, a likely pathway is that if a child is in foster or kinship placement, in their current placement, and if the carer and the child said, yes, let's remain together, then the placement would continue. Or if the child in foster and kinship said, look, I've really enjoyed being with my foster and kinship placement, but I'd like to go out on my own in some sort of supervised sort of arrangement, or if one was in residential or lead tenant placement, they'd also move into a guaranteed supervised independent living arrangement. And I can talk a little bit about how some states are thinking about doing that in a tick. And those who have left care, that is those who have gone and said, no, stuff it, I'm out of here, can't wait, and then have fallen, as many of I've seen and many of you have seen, fallen into homeless shelters within 3 to 4 months of ill thought through plans, we'd bring them back too. Just like our own kids who have gone out, had a go, and then said, Mum, Dad, can I come back? Just like that, we'd have a care system saying, yes, we cared for you for 17 years. I know you tried, didn't work out. Okay, come back into this model and we'll get you up and started. Now, in relation to the reimbursements or costs, we estimated it would be about $22,000, $23,000 per head. That would cover the ongoing carer reimbursements through to 21 that would continue to be paid to the foster kinship placement. Of course, we'd have a case manager pro rata, that is a caseworker for each one of these young people, and of course some financial brokerage to help them hoik them into education and employment. So, how has the homestretch call for reform gone so far? Well, I'd have to say pretty well. Just around 3 years ago, we implemented this campaign, and not one policy gonk, not one government department, not one political party had written in extended care will be our policy. And here, 3 years down the track, we have Tasmania committing to extending care to 21. South Australian Government committing to paying reimbursements of foster and kinship care. No, do not pass, straight down the freeway through to 21. Every foster and kinship care placement will be reimbursed to 21 if that child and carer wishes to stay in South Australia. West Australia is doing a trial for 20 young people, and Victoria have announced 250 young people will be will be offered extending care through to 21. And what's interesting about the Victorian context, if you're looking at how governments are thinking about it, if the young person says at 19, 20, okay, I'm ready to try out on my own, I'm 20, that cost that's going to the carer's reimbursement then travels to the young person to their new independent placement through to 21. So the resources continue through until the age comes off at 21. And where's the homestretch campaign up to? Well, we still seek for every jurisdiction not only the option to be offered as a policy, but legislative change that we write it in for generations to come, that the option of being able to remain in 21 exists in every state and territory. We're also interested in the federal government getting into the game. Look, what are they doing? Well, in fact, they're writing the biggest cheque. If we don't extend care to 21, they're writing, as I pointed out to the federal minister, you're writing cheques every day of the week, minister, even though you don't think you're in the child welfare game. You are. 1.8 billion they'll be writing worth of cheques for a group that could have actually avoided having those cheques written if we stayed their care through to 21. And we're looking for, with good progress in the southern states of Western Australia, South Australia, Tasmania, Victoria, we're also looking for New South Wales and Queensland to get on board and to actually announce this. We feel that part of our campaign is turning our minds to New South Wales and Queensland. So all you New South Wales and Queensland listeners, start sort of writing off to your local member or your minister about this would be a helpful way of also encouraging them to consider that. We've got a planned symposium. Phil's mentioned the likes of Munro, Courtney, those sort of luminaries of extended care. We'll be bringing them out to Australia to further help governments and jurisdictions around the country to talk about how to implement best practice and policy in relation to extended care. And folks, I might leave it to there. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Philip and Paul. We have, quite a bit of time for questions, and we've had some questions coming in. So this first question is one for Philip, and we have a question asking if the international evidence, and they mentioned Matheson, mentions the strict approach to training and employment, and the question was whether that focus improves results for young people or exacerbates the issues that they face. And I guess the broader question is, what do you see as the pros and cons of that kind of focus on extra care being conditional on remaining in education or employment?
Look, I think there are pros and cons, and the pro obviously would be that it does give some young people an incentive to progress education, training or employment that they might be ambivalent about, which will enhance their career pathways. But on the other hand, we've got to remember that a lot of the young people leaving care, not unlike young people in the general community, are just maturing between the ages of 18 to 21, and many of them at 18 or 19 are not ready to go into full-time education or training or employment. But with good support, particularly relationship support may move on from certain issues, and by the time they're 21 or 22 may be ready to do that. And there is a lot of evidence from the international literature that many of the care leavers who end up not only completing higher education but in many cases completing postgraduate higher education do so more often when they're 25 or 30, not when they're 20 or 21. So we need to take that into account, and we need to be careful that when we're setting up extended care criteria with the aim of helping all care leavers, that we don't inadvertently exclude the most vulnerable groups of care leavers from that option.
Just on the employment education, nationally, only 30% of those in out-of-home care make it past year 10. Okay, so it's very likely that the 15 to 17-year-old group will either not be at school or maybe likely to be unemployed. So what we want this program to do, it's very helpful. We've seen the evidence internationally that it doubles education employment rates, but we don't want to make it conditional of entry into it. We want to actually, this is the helping hand to get into it rather than the threshold you must be in. And what's interesting in Tasmania is that in fact they're putting on top of offering in their policy extended care, they're saying if during the care placement at 18 to 21, a child actually ends up getting into tertiary education, they'll pay a carer bonus. So rather than it's a conditional of entry, they're paying a bonus to the caring family if the child... So in a sense, it's important that we see this as an aim. We do want to get children coming out of care into education and employment, but not a condition in relation to the extended care policy entry.
Okay, thank you. We've heard today from both our speakers that many young people who are not in out-of-home care are staying at home until they're 25 or older. And Philip, you also talked about people's age of education, times of entering in sort of employment or education, sort of in their middle 20s. So we had a question from a listener who was wondering why we're talking about 21 instead of 25 in terms of extending care.
Well, it's a good question, and really as policy reform, we think governments improve their policy in this area in an incremental step-by-step base. We take the view that if we just went in and said it must be 25 from 18 to 25, then I think governments were going, well, gee, that's a big leap, and then move into the thinking, well, I pulled myself up by my bootstraps at 22, so what's wrong? But they do, and I think the policy reform debate does hold itself well when we're talking to 21, and people do understand many politicians have their own children there at 21. The second thing is, internationally, when they've got to 21, then you've seen, as we're seeing in the United States now, a commentary about, could we extend that through to 23 or to 25? And what New Zealand have done, actually, they're coming from a lower base slightly, 1 year, isn't it, Phil, from 17 through to 21 rather than 18 to 21. They've said, we will provide support through to 21, but will provide non-financial assistance through to 25. So that's why. So we want this a reachable, achievable, digestible reform for governments. And we think that by saying 21, that sort of fits that mould rather than drifting into, the deserving and undeserving debates that you can get into if you go past that for the initial step in this reform.
I'd agree with Paul, and I think it's noticeable that the youth allowance federally moves into the high rate of New Start allowance at 22 years of age. So probably 21 is a bit of an accepted age at which people can and should move into adulthood, but I certainly wouldn't rule out the possibility that over time it will become evident once extended care is applied in every state and territory and is evaluated that the evaluations will probably demonstrate that it should extend beyond 21 to possibly 25.
Okay, thank you. In some of the examples you gave of international experience, the focus has often been on young people exiting foster care or having extended foster care. And we've had a couple of listeners mention that, of course, not all young people are in foster care, and young people from residential care are often particularly vulnerable when they're exiting care. Paul, you mentioned some other options for extending care for those who are not from foster care. Could you maybe expand on that a little?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. they may only be about 5 to 6% of our out-of-home care population, but they occupy much of our thinking and also really costs to government. They're probably, you know, sort of the higher, I don't know, so the more active, the more expensive in the cost to government. So just quickly dipping into internationally, Scotland have said theoretically in their policy they will offer extended care to residential care, where the UK, the England had said foster kinship, but Scotland said that, and they came up with 4 options on a theoretical options. They said, we'll either place a unit on the same physical side of a residential care, you know, a little studio apartment that sometimes you see things like Kids Undercover and those sort of things offer here in Australia. And the home base will be the staff of the residential care. Will offer something down the road, but still the home base being the residential care that they exited, and so on and so forth. What's interesting here in Australia, and I mentioned that South Australia went fostering kinship, and Tasmania still forming its policy, but here in Victoria, the government was specific. We want this also for residential care. And rather than this phased approach, let's do foster kinship, we want and so we want resi as well. So that's why you see this interesting policy characteristic of the money following the young person, rather than foster kinship, reimbursements. But in fact, if that breaks down, or alternatively, if the kid's coming out of resi, that reimbursement around $10,000 will contribute yearly to his or her rent or his or her board, because it's not going to a carer. So we're enabling a better financial, these kids have got a better financial chance of accessing the housing market because of this. Still they get their worker, and still they get their brokerage in relation to employment education. So the Victorian government have said, no, all in. We're not going to have this phased entry, or not going to have this separate entry. And there's some of the ideas the Victorian government are wrestling with about how we bring it home for residential care kids too.
Okay, thank you. This is a question for Philip, which is whether there's been much research on outcomes for young people who informally remain with their carers after they turn 18, because we know that that does happen, although it's not always formally recorded. But is there much research on how those young people fare?
I'm not sure there is a lot of research in Australia. It has been difficult historically to complete research on the post-18 group in Australia because governments have not supported that group and have not. It has been difficult to access that particular cohort for research. We have heard anecdotally in a number of research projects that many foster or kin carers do continue support beyond 18, often from their own resources, and certainly feedback from some of the young people in that situation has been that support has been fantastic and an absolutely key attribute in enabling them to have good outcomes in areas like education and training and employment. So I guess that the value of extended care is that for many young people who've been growing up in foster care or kinship care, it is now formalising arrangements that were already being made, but mainly through the generosity of foster carers and kin carers.
And just briefly on that, and I've had a couple of grandparents sit in my office, you know, and they say it's expensive raising teenagers on the pension pool. And so they're still committed to running the care, but really they're being asked to finance this and themselves. And I was asked the question recently on a radio interview, and they said, well, really, Paul, doesn't the system really, you know, look after them anyway? Don't foster carers and kinship carers just step, as Phil's explained, step up to the mark and just take on their care? And I said, yes, they do. But why should we be having a system of care that's reliant on the good heart of the volunteer to finish off the job? To finish off the development and the growth. Why are we reliant on that rather than that is a formal part of that? It's like, I mean, I'm sorry folks, I'm from Melbourne, but it's sort of like building the Westgate Bridge and stopping in 3/4 of the way and said, that's a job well done, I think we can all go home now. And or the Sydney Harbour or whatever that bridge, the Story Bridge in Brisbane. I mean, we're stopping prematurely our execution of care at 18. It is premature as a parent. We may not be a natural parent, but government is the parent it is. And we have to finish off the job. And that's why I think formally, rather than relying on the good heart of the volunteer, being the foster and kinship, to do it, is the right thing for Australia to do.
Thank you. We've also had a question about the number of young people and care leavers in particular who have complex needs and how extending care might work for this particular group. What considerations might there be for extending care to those with particularly complex needs? And we know that amongst care leavers there are very high rates of, say, mental illness, physical or emotional difficulties. So what kind of considerations would go into that kind of extended care?
Well, look, I think it's a good question because many of them will be overrepresented with mental health issues and with other complex issues, or even how the care systems looked after them, and whether or history of trauma in families or even trauma in the care system. I mean, many of these kids are going to have some issue one way or the other. I think what we're looking for is at least a platform of care to, first of all, hold the base. And see if they can offer them a base between 18 and 21. Secondly, I think we've got to become more, government become more sensitised to the experience of the 18, 19, 20-year-old coming out of care. Really, though I issued some sort of statistics about what we do know about young people coming out of the care, the care system's very aloof. No, government services, even though government has grown up these children, are very aloof. We don't give them gold passes into services, yet we know they'll be overrepresented in hospital and in mental health services. So I think where we'd like to go is, as we build the base, we start specialising or bringing in, whether it's in fact actually resources, not only for employment engagement exercise, but in resources to bring some sort of modern mental health of a young adult nature to these young people, is a very good question, and it's very relevant for this target group. So in a sense, we're looking for a population base reform, and then within that, understanding, well, who needs those special needs and can government actually finance it? And I think if government saw that, in fact, like a parent sees their responsibilities raising their children continues past after they've moved out of home, we could see a government see that their responsibilities for the children they've raised continue at least through to 21, and look at the government services on hand that they have to actually leverage those services to say this should be a priority group between 18 and 21.
I think there is a strong economic and social argument for particularly supporting that group of young people, whether we call them complex needs or vulnerable young people, and we can go two ways. As a community, we can say that we're going to be like any other parent in the community that have young people living at home who have difficulties, and we hope between the age of 18 to 21, or it might be 18 to 25, those difficulties will in some way resolve themselves, or at least we can get them under control, or we can say let it rip, let them into the crisis intervention systems, whether it be mental health system or income support or criminal justice, which are very, very expensive for government, very expensive and harmful for the community and harmful for the young people themselves. So I certainly think there is a strong argument economically as well as socially for extended care as a system that actually does ideally prioritise that group that do have complex needs.
Thank you very much. We've had, I suppose, further questions about specific groups of care leavers, and in particular about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people, and both whether there are special considerations that might need to be taken into account for these young people, and in particular whether there's a consideration of, I suppose, helping them to connect to culture or can maintain a connection to culture if they're remaining with a kinship or foster carer beyond the age of 18.
We're currently undertaking a national study of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander care leavers in Australia. It's the first ever study, and one of the reasons for the study is really to find out the basic data and basic statistics. So although we know that there are a very high disproportionate number of Indigenous young people in the out-of-home care system. We actually know very little about how many or what percentage leave care in every state and territory. We know very little about the services that support them, whether they're run by Aboriginal community-controlled organisations or not, and we know very little about the particular cultural and community supports provided to this group of young people, including particularly whether they have access to cultural plans or not. So I think we really need to ensure that we have the key knowledge about what is happening to this group of young people currently, how many are leaving care in every state and territory from, how many are leaving from resi care, from kinship care, from foster care. We have heard anecdotally that many of them are leaving care very young, often before 15 years and 9 months, which is the cut-off age for leaving care support in Victoria, and I think in most states and territories. So, you know, I think the first key aim here is to identify what is happening to that cohort and what are their different experiences compared to non-Indigenous care leavers, so that we can then identify the particular service supports needed to meet their needs.
Okay, thank you, Philip and Paul. That's all we have time for today. And thank you everyone for attending today. Please follow the link on your screen to our website so that you can continue the conversation. And as you leave the webinar, a short survey will open in a new window, and we greatly appreciate your feedback. Please note too, any unanswered questions may be published along with your first name on the CFCA website for a response from the presenters after the webinar. So please let us know if you don't want your question or first name to be published on our website. And hopefully we'll see you again next time. Thank you.